Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It is 1:30 right now. I know we still have some folks logging on, but I'm going to go ahead and get started. Just want to welcome everyone to Ohio EPA's 2022 Virtual Compliance Assistance Conference. My name is Kelly Toth, and I'm with the Central District Office here at Ohio EPA, and I will be moderating the Introduction to Air Permitting and Reporting session. Ohio EPA's 2022 Virtual Compliance Assistance Conference has 24 sessions over 2 weeks, and we are just getting started. Today, this is the final of 3 sessions focusing on air pollution control. Registration information and conference agenda are located in the Ohio EPA's conference webpage. We hope you can join us for additional conference sessions, and please remember it's never too late to sign up for the next conference session, and all sessions are being recorded for you to view later. All right, before we get started, we'd like to point your attention to one of today's environmental fun facts on the slide. Depending on your county, your air pollution contact could either be an Ohio EPA district office or a local agency. Local air agency. Local air agencies are contracted organizations located throughout the state that perform primarily the same functions as Ohio EPA district offices. These agencies predate Ohio EPA and typically are part of a city, county, or health district organization. I'll add another fun fact to that in that Columbus is the only large city in Ohio to not have a local air agency. We're all governed by Ohio EPA. To learn more about your air pollution contact, scan the QR code on this slide to get more information. And with that, it is my pleasure to turn it over to today's esteemed presenters and air pollution experts, Racheal Davies and Stephanie Habinak. Racheal is a senior environmental specialist in the Division of Air Pollution Control in our Southeast District office with over 10 years of air experience. And Stephanie is a permitting and compliance supervisor in air pollution in Central District office, where she reviews permit terms and conditions and provides assistance to other permit writers and has 14 years of air experience. I'd like to welcome Racheal, who will be leading us off.
Thank you, Kelly. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Introduction to Air Permitting and Reporting. So today we're going to get to know the different permitting options available from the Division of Air Pollution Control and review the available permitting options. We'll also provide an overview of completing an application, how to calculate emissions of criteria and air toxic pollutants. And then this session will continue with an overview of record keeping and reporting requirements contained in a typical air permit. As Kelly mentioned, Stephanie and I are both presenters today, and our contact information is on this slide if you need to reach out to us with any questions or concerns. So today we want to make sure that you understand why obtaining a permit before installation is important. We want you to be able to identify what types of sources need air permits and gain a basic knowledge of permit application forms, completion tips, and processing timeframes. We also want you to learn what construction activities are allowed prior to permit issuance. Our workload is split up by county for Ohio EPA. So as Kelly mentioned, your district office or local air agency is governed by the location as indicated on this map. If you have any questions on who your permitting contact is, that you can look that up on Ohio EPA's website. Our contacts can be organized by the office that they are out of or by county. So the basic permit liability is that it is the company's obligation to determine if an air permit is needed. It's also the company's obligation to apply for and obtain a permit prior to installing and starting up the equipment. And it's the company's obligation to comply with that permit. When we write a permit for your facility, we write them for specific equipment at that facility location. So a new permit is needed if equipment is moved to a new address. Generally, moving equipment within the building is okay. But if you are moving locations, or you may have to reevaluate that permitting. If your facility is transferred to a new owner, we can transfer those permits to the new owner also. So air permits are important because they are typically the focus of EPA inspections. When an inspector goes to your facility, we'll check if the company is conducting the monitoring and maintaining the records required by your air permit. We'll also check to see if everything that needs an air permit has one. Your permit terms and conditions will summarize all applicable federal and state regulations. So within those permit terms, it will tell you what it is that you're supposed to do to comply with those federal and state regulations. Common violations that we see are facilities installing and operating equipment without obtaining proper permits. We also see sometimes facilities aren't maintaining the records required by the permits, or they have permit limits that they're exceeding. We also sometimes find facilities not maintaining the air pollution control equipment. So what needs an air permit? So that's a loaded question. There's no definitive list that exists. So generally, a permit is needed for an air pollution or air contaminant source, and we evaluate that on an emissions unit by emission unit basis. So an emission unit, we look at each individual process within the facility. So each separate activity or operation that emits air pollutants may need a permit. Air pollutants include criteria pollutants, which are particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxides, volatile organic compounds, carbon monoxide, and lead. If your facility or your emission unit emits hazardous air pollutants, that is considered an air contaminant source, and it may also need a permit. So the permit will only cover that air pollution source, and a company may need several air permits to cover all of the plant operations. So when you're walking through your facility or planning out your future facility, something to keep in mind are 4 rules of thumb for what may need an air permit. So something with a stack, vent, or dust collector, something that uses solvents, paints, inks, or adhesives, something that burns fuel, or something that causes smoke, dust, or odors. Those types of sources are considered air contaminant sources. Common things that need air permits include a boiler. The boiler would have a stack or a vent, a printing press, and a paint booth. They may use inks, paints, or solvents, a dry cleaning machine, and stone crushing equipment. So you can see from the picture, stone crushing equipment would generate dust. Not everything is required to get an air permit. In fact, Ohio EPA has 3 options for exemption. Our first option is our permanent exemptions. Our permanent exemptions are listed in Ohio Administrative Code 3745-3103. And in this rule, it lists about 60 different types of equipment and processes that do not require air permits. If you find that the source that you're wanting to install or have already installed is listed under a permanent exemption, you do not have to notify Ohio EPA. Some things exempt under permanent exemptions include lab fume hoods, storage tanks of a certain size, gas-fired boilers or heaters that are less than 10 million BTU per hour, small solvent parts washers with non-chlorinated solvents, solvent stills with less than 20-gallon capacity, and non-vented machining operations. So let's take a quick poll. If an emission unit meets an exemption in Ohio Administrative Code 3745-3103, is it exempt from all Ohio EPA rules?
Thank you, Rachel. We're going to go ahead and launch the poll right now. It may take a moment for you to see it, but when it's viewable, please click on your response when it shows on your screen. All right, looks like we're mostly there. If anyone else wants to put their response in, I will close it out in a moment. Oh, actually, we're only about 40%. I'll give it give it a few more minutes. All right, we're most of the way there. I'm going to close it out in just one moment. Okay, and I'm going to share the results.
You guys are on it today. So I haven't even covered this. So most of you are correct. If an emission unit is exempt under Ohio Administrative Code 3745-3103, it is not exempt from all Ohio EPA rules, but it is exempt from a permitting requirement. So the next air permit exemption is a permit by rule provision, which is found in the same rule in Section C. So a permit by rule provision is a predefined operating conditions and record keeping requirements that are listed in the permit by rule. If you decide to proceed with a permit by rule, all that you require is a simple one-page notification that you send into Ohio EPA. So there's no waiting for a permit like you would for a PTI or a PTIO. We currently have permit by rule provisions for emergency generators, plastic parts molding, small crushers, groundwater and soil cleanup, auto body shops, gas stations, gas-fired boilers, printing shops, and small roadways. The permit by rules will list what exactly you need to do to comply with those permit by rule. For example, emergency generators are required to not exceed 500 hours of non-emergency use, and the permit by rule requires the facility to track the hours of non-emergency use, among other things. And the last permit exemption that a facility can get is a de minimis source exemption, which is listed in Ohio Administrative Code 3745-1505. In order to be considered de minimis, an emission unit is required to emit less than 10 pounds per day of any criteria pollutant. So particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxide, organic compounds, carbon monoxide, or lead. The unit is also required to emit less than 1 ton per year of hazardous air pollutants. A list of hazardous air pollutants can be found on US EPA's website. The source alone or in combination with similar sources cannot exceed a potential emissions in excess of 25 tons per year for any of the criteria pollutants. For example, if your printing press alone by itself is less than 10 pounds per day, but you have 30 of them within the facility and that combined potential to emit exceeds 25 tons per year, then you would not be considered de minimis on an individual basis. The de minimis provision also requires that the unit cannot be subject to federal rules. And in order to determine if you're a de minimis source, you are required to conduct emissions calculations. So if you want to conduct a permit self-assessment at your site, the first thing that you want to do is tour your plant to identify all air pollution sources using the 4 rules of thumb that we talked about. So something with a stack, vent, or dust collector, something that uses inks, paints, solvents, or adhesives, something that burns fuel, something that generates dust, smoke, or odors. Next, you'll want to determine what operations fit the permitted exemptions or permit by rule provisions. Then you'll want to determine if the remaining operations can be considered de minimis by doing emissions calculations. And anything that's left over that is not exempt would need a permit. You'll want to assume that it needs a permit. So installation permits are required for new sources. A permit to install is an installation permit that's issued for Title V facilities only. Title V facilities are our larger emitting facilities, and they emit more than 100 tons per year of any criteria pollutant. Non-Title V facilities are our smaller facilities, and they would receive a permit to install and operate, or a PTIO. So those installation permits are required before installing and operating any equipment, and it can take 1 to 6 months to get a permit. So that time frame depends on the complexity of the project. And once that permit is issued, it allows 18 months to start construction. If a facility finds that they need more than 18 months, we do offer an extension. So in the state of Ohio, we have about 550 large emitters or Title V facilities. Those Title V facilities are required to receive a permit to install PTI for each new installation or modification at the site. In addition to the PTI, they are required to get a Title V operating permit that covers everything at the site for continued operation. So the PTI allows installation and them to begin operation, and the PTO, permit to operate, allows continued operation of the site. In Ohio, we have about 14,000 non-Title V facilities, and we have a little over 800 facilities that are considered synthetic minor facilities. So synthetic minor facilities are non-Title V facilities that have voluntarily restricted emissions to avoid more complex regulations, such as the Title V program or federal rules. Both non-Title V and synthetic minor facilities will need one or more PTIO to cover the installation and the operation for all air pollution sources at the facility. So the PTIO, the permit to install and operate, covers the installation and continued operation. It's all combined in one, unlike our Title V program. If the source or site is synthetic minor or has a federally enforceable PTIO, they have a 5-year term for those permits. So every 5 years, they'll have to apply for a renewal. For all other PTIOs, there is a 10-year renewal term for those units. And our system is set up that all PTIOs for the facility will expire on the same date. When applying for a permit, there's generally 2 types of permits that you can receive: an individual PTI or PTIO, or a general PTI, PTIO. So an individual PTI, PTIO, sometimes we refer to this as a case-by-case permit. These permits are customized for the facility operations and equipment. A general permit is a CAN permit. So you can go on our website and view the terms and conditions of the permit beforehand, but we cannot change those permit terms for you. General permits have a faster processing time, usually around 45 days or less. There's a simplified application form. It does not require emissions data, but only certain operations and sizes can receive a general permit. Ohio EPA is working towards adding more categories of general permits. So some of our current general permit categories include dry cleaning, boilers, stone crushing, ready mixed concrete, metal parts coating, oil and gas well sites, diesel engines, human crematories, roadways and parking areas, storage piles, mineral extraction, anaerobic digesters, natural gas compressor stations, and tub grinders. So these types of equipments can receive general permits if they fall into the certain size requirements allowed for by the general permit. So there are 2 different ways to apply for a permit. Non-Title V facilities can apply for a permit using hard copy application forms. These are accessible from our website. You can also apply using our online e-business center using Air Services. For Title V facilities and synthetic minor facilities, they are required to use the online service. However, for non-Title V facilities, it's optional. So the hard copy application forms consist of 2 main sections. First part is form number 3150A. 3150A has both a section 1 and a section 2. And in this form, it will include general company data, emissions, and control information. You'll also be required to submit an emissions activity category or an EAC form. The EAC form includes very specific information about the equipment and process data. We have 43 types of EAC forms currently for those different facility or different emission unit types. So as I mentioned, Form 3150A has a Section 1. This section 1 is a facility-wide section, and in it, it includes the facility address and contact information, applicable federal rules. You'll note when you want your permit evaluation report to be due. If you have any trade secret information, you will check yes or no and include any trade secret claims. And it requires a signature by the authorized representative of the site. Now, Section 2 is specific for each emission unit. Section 2 includes your installation schedule. When do you need this permit by? An estimate of types and quantities of emissions. You'll list the BAT, the best available technology description, a description of pollution control equipment. You'll include a process diagram of the equipment, include stack and emission point data for modeling, and request any voluntary conditions or limitations. This form will also remind you to attach the EAC form. Okay, so emissions data. In Section 2, you'll include emissions data for each emission unit. This includes estimates of the maximum emissions expected, so your potential to emit for the site. Potential to emit is evaluated assuming that you are operating under worst case conditions 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. These potential to emit calculations are required for all criteria pollutants, hazardous air pollutants, and Ohio EPA's air toxics. So Ohio EPA's air toxics are listed in Ohio Administrative Code 3745-11401. So this list includes all hazardous air pollutants plus additional pollutants. Section 2 will require you to include the actual emissions, what your normal operations are, and your requested emissions, which is your maximum potential to emit emissions. So how do you calculate your emissions? So you can use emissions factors such as AP42, material balance, stack test results, or vendor information. The EAC forms include instructions on how to calculate these emissions, and there's also a lot of good information in Ohio EPA's engineering guides, such as guides 4, 45, and 80. You want to make sure information regarding equipment and production capacities match those on the EAC form. You'll also want to make sure that you have your calculation shown for your normal and your maximum possible, your worst case emission rates. So the EAC form has detailed specifications and capacities of equipment being installed and operated. So depending on which source you have will depend on what EAC form you use. An engine, for example, may include the engine size, the manufacturer, the serial number, installation dates, that sort of information, so we can properly evaluate rules and your potential to emit. You'll include information such as your usage rate of raw materials and your fuels. It may include production rates of your finished projects, and it will include the types of pollution control measures that you take for this site. So how much does an air permit cost? So there's no fee to file an application with Ohio EPA, but there is a one-time fee associated with the PTI or PTIO, so with the application to install or modify the source. Those fees will vary depending on the type and capacity of the equipment. And generally what we see is they range from $100 to $1,250 per emission unit. If you are applying for a permit for a unit that has already been installed or operated, those fees are automatically doubled. Ohio EPA has our fee schedule listed at the link on this slide that details how we establish those fees for each emission unit. So the company is going to complete the PTIO application, and then they'll submit it to the appropriate Ohio EPA district office or local air agency. You'll want to be sure to plan ahead for timing. So it is very helpful if you relay your construction schedule to us so we can make sure that we're trying to get your permit out on time for you. And you may also need to plan for draft permit issuance. So if your site is seeking a synthetic minor or federally enforceable restriction, those permits are required to go draft for 30 days. You'll want to make sure that the application is complete. You'll want to ensure that it's signed by the appropriate official. In Ohio EPA, in our answer place, we have information on who is supposed to sign that application. The link for that is listed on this slide. You also want to ensure that the application has all required elements. So Section 1 and Section 2 of the application form, your EAC form, process flow diagram, potential to omit calculations, etc. You'll also want to be sure that your forms are completed for maximum operational flexibility. Common problems that we see are people using the incorrect forms. So the forms for Section 1, Section 2, and EACs are located on Ohio EPA's website at the link listed on this slide. We often see no original signature on those application forms. Problems with the process flow diagram. Either it's missing or it doesn't match the application forms. And sometimes we see insufficient information. So maybe the forms aren't filled out all the way, calculations weren't included, it's missing pages, that sort of thing. We also find problems with emission calculations. So sometimes outdated emission factors or guidance is used to develop those, or the facility doesn't calculate the emission unit or facility's potential to emit. So again, that potential to emit is your worst case operating scenario, assuming that you're operating for 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Potential to emit is necessary to determine Title V applicability, to determine applicability for some major source MAC regulations, and to determine if major source, new source review applies. So I noted before that you want to make sure that you fill out your forms for maximum operational flexibility. Sometimes we see failure to plan for the source operation to meet needs. So if your source is designed to process, 300 widgets an hour at maximum capacity, that is what we would anticipate you to apply for, even if your normal operations are, maybe 150 widgets per hour. And one of the big things that we see is not reviewing the draft permit terms and conditions for problems before we go out for issuance. So when we draft the permit terms and conditions, generally we send those to the facility so that you can review those terms and conditions. This is a very important step that you don't want to miss. You will want to review those terms and conditions to ensure that, that permit makes sense for your source, and that you understand what compliance requirements you have. And if you have any questions on those requirements, you should reach out to us. So what should you consider for flexibility at the site? So your hours of operation, your production volumes, both short and long term, your hourly rates and your annual rates, and any operational limitations. So as I mentioned, if you'll want to evaluate that source for potential to emit using your worst case operating scenario, assuming 24 hours a day, 365 days per year. Okay, so once you submit an application to Ohio EPA, the first thing that we do is we begin to process that permit, and we will conduct a preliminary completeness review within the first 14 days. Once that is done, we'll notify you by letter. And in that letter, it will include our name, phone number, and email address of the permit reviewer. Then we will conduct a technical review of the application, and during that time, we'll begin writing the permit terms and conditions. Once the permit writer has completed those terms and conditions, we'll send it on to central office, our Columbus office, for issuance. This technical review usually takes 1 to 3 months. During that time, you'll want to stay in contact with your district permit reviewer, and we may be reaching out with questions. If we do reach out with questions, it is very important that you respond appropriately and promptly to the request for information. Ohio EPA is required to process your permit within 180 days. If we ask questions to you in order to be able to process your permit, that clock stops. So if you are expecting that permit in 180 days, it is extremely important that you respond to us so that we can get it out the door. So like I mentioned, we'll do the technical review and then we'll send it to our central office for review and issuance. So they will perform a review. This usually takes less than 1 month, and they may return it to the district office to address any comments or concerns. During this time, you might receive requests for additional information or clarification from the district office or local air agency that you're working with, or even our central office reviewers. Once they have reviewed the permit, central office will issue the permit, usually within 2 to 4 weeks. So there are two issuance options. The first option is going draft for 30 days. Synthetic minor permits, permits of high public interest, and any major new source review sources are required to go draft for 30 days. A lot of permits are able to go final, so there is no draft issuance. The permits are published on Ohio EPA's website at the link listed here, and they're also available through Ohio EPA's eDoc on our website. So if you go to epa.ohio.gov, you will see a button such as the one on the right side of this slide labeled eDoc. If you click into that, it will take you right into that system. So let's take a quick poll. Do you know who the permit writer is for your facility?
Thank you, Racheal. I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll for everybody. It might be a delay, but once it shows up on your screen, go ahead and select your choice. All right, we're a little over half of results in, so if you haven't responded yet, go ahead and submit your response now, and I will close it down in a moment. Okay, there we go. It's closed.
Great, so it seems like about half of you do know who your permit writer is for your facility. So if you want to find who your permit writer is for your facility, that information is included on the preliminary completeness letter that you'll receive. You can also go to our website and see who the contact is by county. Okay, so tips for faster permits. Probably the biggest one is to make sure the application is complete. Sometimes it's also helpful to discuss the application or installation with the district office reviewer before submitting the application. And it is important to stay in contact with the district permit reviewer. So if we have questions or concerns, please respond to us. Please stay in contact with us. Ohio EPA has Ohio EPA's rush list. So if you need faster permit processing, the rush list may be something you want to look into. In order to be put on Ohio EPA's rush list, you must submit a written notice of the day by which the permit is absolutely needed and a written demonstration of the economic or financial hardship if a permit is delayed. More information of Ohio EPA's rush list can be found on Ohio EPA's website at the link listed on this slide. If you're wanting to keep track of your permit, probably the easiest way is by contacting your local district office. So that permit writer, reaching out to them and just asking for an update. You can also contact our central office at the phone number listed here. And you can look up electronic copies through DAPC's website at the link listed here. So some helpful permitting resources include DAPC permit webpage The link is listed here for that. So on the DAPC permits webpage, you'll find those permitting application forms, information on the rush list, and just some general permit information. If you're looking for emissions factors, there's excellent information on US EPA's website. So the link listed here will take you to a website that has a link for AP42 that we mentioned earlier, and US EPA's WebFire, and a handful of other emission factor sources. Another great resource is your district office permitting engineers. So reaching out to that permit contact is typically pretty helpful. And lastly, Ohio EPA offers the Office of Compliance Assistance and Pollution Prevention, OCAP. They offer one-on-one help with permit applications for small businesses. So they can be contacted at the phone number listed here, or more information can be accessed on our website at the link listed here. Okay, so what type of construction activities are allowed before a permit is issued? The answer to that question is going to depend on if you're a minor new source or a major new source. So minor new sources, which includes minor modifications, can do almost everything except hook up the utilities and begin operation. So minor here does not mean a major modification, a major stationary source, new source review, synthetic minor, or netting projects. Now, a major new source, including major modifications, they can only do temporary activities like site clearing, excavation, temporary utility connections, but nothing permanent can be done. So these site preparation activities are all done at the risk to the owner-operator, and no permit is guaranteed. For a full list of the allowed site preparation construction activities, you'll want to see Ohio Administrative Code 3745, 3133. So site preparation activities can be conducted as listed in that rule. Now, once a PTIO application has been filed, so PTIO is going to be one of those minor sources, those foundations, footers for building and equipment, they can begin to pour those. You can also have electrical service, piping and sewers, and ductwork hooked up, but not including the connections to the source control equipment. So the way that I think about this is you can do everything except for plug it in and turn it on. The source and control device equipment and parts can be placed and secured to its foundation or final location, but they cannot be operated. Okay, so key takeaways for the first half of this session are the 4 rules of thumb for identifying an air contaminant source. So again, those are something with a stack, vent, or dust collector, something that uses inks, paints, solvents, or adhesives, something that burns fuel, or something that generates dust, smoke, or odors. You'll want to stay on top of equipment changes at your facility, and you'll want to communicate with Ohio EPA regarding equipment changes and throughout the permitting process. It's also important to know that some construction activities can likely occur while you're waiting for your permit. And with that, I'll hand it off to Stephanie Habinak, who will be presenting the second part of our presentation, which is requirements of permits. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, for the handoff, and thank you everyone for being here with us today. So Rachel gave you some really good information about what equipment at your facility needs an air permit. She provided you some really great tips with how to fill out and submit an air permit application, and also covered the pre-construction activities that you may or may not be able to do with your project. In the second part of this session, we're going to focus on understanding the different sections of an air permit and their purpose, be able to identify the various report types required by the permit, and gain knowledge about what permitting resources are available. So let's start with our first poll question. Does a typical Ohio EPA air pollution compliance specialist complete more permits or site visits in a calendar year?
All right, thank you, Stephanie. I'm going to launch that poll. Interesting question. It may take a moment before it's viewable to you, but please click your response when it shows up on your screen. We're a little over 50% and growing quickly. So if you've not selected yet, go ahead and put in your response and I will close it out in just a moment. All right. The poll's now closed and I will share the results.
Interesting results. I was prepared for everyone to say permits. So we're about split right down the middle. So we process a lot of air permits in the state of Ohio. Based on 2021's numbers, we processed 1,874 final permitting actions. And that is compared to 473 compliance evaluations that were conducted. That being said, if you have any permitting questions, we're always here to discuss. The sooner you reach out about a permitting project or a question, the better time you're going to have overall with Ohio EPA and the permitting process. So this slide is a general disclaimer about what we do and don't do. Our responsibilities are primarily permitting, and that's everything from having a pre-meeting, which is talking about your projects, creating a schedule for that project if that's applicable, reviewing the application, drafting terms, working with you on the terms, taking into account your revisions and making those changes. We also do site visits and or inspections. Inspections are mainly for Title V and FEPTIO. Site visits, we're usually out there in the field due to maybe a complaint investigation of some type. We also witness stack tests. We do complaint investigations. The primary cause for those are usually dust and odor. Provide technical assistance, whether it's to the regulated community, to citizens, to people out of state looking to do business in Ohio. And we also do report reviews. Some things that we don't do, but typically get pulled into, and if you ever have questions with, I'm sure we can get you there to where you need to go. But we do not do zoning approvals, refrigerant reclamation, worker safety, indoor air quality, which is also important, but we don't handle that, and noise complaints. So now that your permit's issued, there's next steps that you need to undertake to make sure that you're in compliance with your permit. Hopefully you had some involvement in the permitting process or had a chance to review the terms before issuance. If not, step one is to read and understand your permit. Secondly, before you get your permit, I suggest having some type of record keeping set up. Make it as simple as possible and train employees. Put in notices and alerts on your calendar for when reports are due so you can submit them before the due dates. And if you haven't already and the opportunity presents itself, I highly recommend getting into air services because once you submit those reports, it's an instantaneous submittal. You don't have to worry about emailing them or putting them in the mail and making sure to where they go where they have to. Also know what is happening at your facility, what changes are on the horizon, or what changes need to happen with this permit that's coming down the line. And also, a very important point is to foster a good relationship with neighbors. When you read your permit, you'll see there is a structure to the document. The permit itself will contain cover pages that have general information about the process that's being permitted, different authorization, and important due dates such as expiration for the permit. The standard terms and conditions vary a little bit between being a major or a minor source, but generally they're all the same, at least structure-wise in the permit. After the standard terms, you'll have facility-wide terms that apply to the whole facility. And then the meat of the permit, which is the emission unit terms, which is where you're going to find the bulk of your requirements and specifically what you've been applying for. So when Racheal was talking about EAC forms and things like that, those are the types of emission units and terms that you're going to see in this section. At a minimum, your air permit will be 10 pages long, front and back, so technically 20 pages. The cover pages provide details on how to appeal the permit, which is through the Environmental Reviews Appeal Commission, or ERAC. You have 30 days to file an appeal, and a $70 filing fee is required. Additional assistance can be found through our OCAP or the Ohio Air Quality Development Authority to see if you're eligible for any cost savings opportunities. These opportunities can be through financing or tax exemptions. The cover page also has a link to our online survey where you can provide feedback about your permitting experience. Remember to reach out early and often, and you'll have a good experience. Permits are also available electronically, and that link is provided. Additionally, and probably most importantly in the document, is information regarding the emergency spill hotline and complaints info. The spill hotline number will be included in that cover page and will give you 24/7 access to report any non-emergencies or malfunctions to Ohio EPA. So after working through those cover pages, we're going to come into the standard terms and conditions, which will have requirements you'll have to demonstrate compliance with. The standard terms and conditions are broken down into smaller sections, one being the authorization page, which is a separate page signed by the director that will list the permit description, fee amount, PER due date, and authorization to install and operate only those sources listed in the permit. Additionally, permit renewal and expiration date will be provided in this document. There is also a statement that once your permit is due for renewal, you will receive a reminder sent 6 months in advance to that expiration date. Even if you don't receive a reminder, a renewal application is still due prior to expiration. And lastly, expiration. PTIOs will expire 18 months after issuance if construction hasn't started or the facility hasn't entered into a contract. This date is important because it shows up in annual permitting requirements through the permit evaluation report that we'll talk about later on. If you're unable to meet that 18-month deadline, you can apply for a 12-month extension ahead of time, but you'll have to provide a cause. Again, the standard terms touch on shutdown emission units. These are units that are no longer operating. Even though the units are no longer operating, records still need to be maintained for a period of 5 years. Transfer of ownership is also found in this section. A transfer of ownership does not require a fee to file, and the notice should be signed by the responsible official within 30 days of the transfer. This can be done instantaneously through Air Services under the owner contact change. If not, you can always email your permit writer and find out what information they need to make the changes for you. A permit modification isn't required for this activity, but some facilities prefer to have an official permit document with their name on that. We can do that. It would be an administrative modification, and there is a fee associated with that. But if you can hang in there until the next renewal cycle, the next renewal will have the updated owner contact information, and you won't have to pay a fee. So now we're starting to move into more of the bulk of the specific terms and conditions for the facility. The first being the facility-wide terms. You may or may not have any requirements there, and if you don't, that's okay. Typically, what we see here are terms that apply to the entire facility, including permit-exempt and de minimis units that don't require an air permit. Common examples of terms that you'll see here are synthetic minor restrictions that might limit a facility-wide VOC limit, or a HAP limit, which is typically that 9.9 and 24.9 ton per year rolling 12-month summation. Additionally, you might find state rules here that include work practices, records of reporting for a whole facility. OAC Rule 37, 45, 21, 25, the reinforced plastic composite manufacturing operations, does have requirements for permit-exempt emission units, such as cleaning and storage operations. Additionally, here you might find federal rules that are included also in the emission unit specific terms. And you might also find federal rules that Ohio EPA is not the delegated authority. So we don't regulate them, and we kind of just give you a disclaimer that they're not in our jurisdiction, but they may or may not apply. That would be on the permittee to make that determination. Additionally, a general reporting instructions statement may be placed here instead of the emission unit by emission unit section to save space. This reporting term can look something like details about how to submit a hard copy report or how to submit through air services instead of being placed throughout the permit. So now we're on to probably the bulkiest part of the permit, which is the emission unit terms. And that's intentional because that's where all of your compliance requirements are going to be. It's designed to have the most important information first, like the applicable rules and limits, followed by supporting information to demonstrate compliance, which is what your operational restrictions are, monitoring and record keeping, reporting, testing, and miscellaneous requirements. So the table that you see here is what you're going to see in any type of PTI, PTIO, or Title V PTO. Under the applicable rules and requirements, you'll see the rule citation under, in this case, a state rule, the Ohio Administrative Code 3745-1707. And then next to it, it spells out the applicable emission limitation for that rule, which is the stack capacity limit of 20% as a 6-minute average. That's just provided by the rule. So this table is the basis for where you're going to find your requirements and what applies. If the rule appears, but it's exempt, there will be an explanation provided, what I like to call a negative declaration. For example, the cousin to this rule, the fugitive emissions rule, would say, maybe you're not located in an Appendix A area or a certain county, so the opacity limit doesn't apply to you. Additionally, below the table, there will be an additional terms and conditions section below that may expand on some of these points or limitations being established in the table. So following the applicable emission limitations, we'll move into the operational restrictions. They provide operating limits to ensure compliance with the emission limits in the table. These can take the form of production rates, hours of operation, use of control equipment, using only a certain type of fuel, such as natural gas. Other examples with control equipment include using a dust collector and requiring the emission unit to vent to a dust collection system whenever the emission unit is in operation. There could also be a daily operating hours that the emission unit shall not exceed. In addition, a lot of these rates, especially the production rates or hours of operation, will usually be expressed as some type of rolling 12-month summation, which basically creates an annual limit, but also allows you to demonstrate compliance in the short term on a monthly basis. So that's how those kind of protect those emission limits established in the table. So they're very important. The monitoring and record keeping is designed for proper operation of the emission units and control equipment. It's designed for ongoing compliance with rules, limits, and operational restrictions in the permit. It's pretty multifaceted. It can be per emission unit, or it can be facility-wide. It can be for a group of emission units if they're similar sources or have similar emissions processes. Additionally, the monitoring and record keeping can be negotiated at the application stage. If your facility has very unique or specific process operations and the standard terms and conditions provided don't make sense for you, but you have a plan or a strategy for what could work, feel free to share it with your permit writer. You know, we see a lot of stuff, but we don't see everything, and we're happy to work with you to get you what you need to maintain compliance. So here's a monitoring example. This is a parametric monitoring example for a pressure drop on a bag house. And what you see here is you have your pressure drop gauge, and the bracket is showing you the range of where it should be. And obviously it's outside of that range. It's imperative to read and understand your permit because you might find yourself in a situation like that. But even more importantly, your staff is more than likely to find a situation like that. It's imperative to have them trained on how to operate the equipment to ensure that operations are in compliance. Similarly, we've seen facilities that will provide ranges on their record-keeping logbook that staff use or your environmental person uses. Additionally, folks will post those ranges on the equipment itself. So depending on what kind of training protocol you have or how staff operate, it's right there front and center what the range should be, and should be very clear if the process is within or outside of that range. Back to our first example of the opacity rule that was cited in the table in previous slides, visible emission checks are going to show up in your monitoring and record keeping. Here in this situation, visible emission checks can be daily, weekly, or monthly. Operators do not need to be Method 9 certified to perform visible emission checks, but they should be familiar enough with the process to identify an abnormal operation. So record keeping can be kept and the requirements incorporated, either electronic or hard copy forms, whatever's easier for you, but keep it easy and make it fail safe. Avoid having excess paperwork. And you can have multiple records within a log, but make sure that each record is clearly identified. Records can include your monitoring data, test results, SEMS data, maintenance logs. Make sure that your staff is trained and that they understand why they're keeping those records. It's a lot easier for them to understand why they're doing it, and it will encourage them to keep doing it. And if you ever have any questions, you can always contact OCAP or your permit writer for help with records creation. So there are three major categories of reports: compliance reports, immediate notifications, and fee reports. Self-reporting is something facilities are required to do to let Ohio EPA know how it's going. Ohio EPA will review these reports, and if there's an issue, if something doesn't make sense based on their interactions with the facility after writing a permit or maybe writing an NOV, they can come back and ask for clarifying information. So it's really important that your compliance reports are accurate and submitted on time. Some ways of notifying Ohio EPA through reports are whether or not the permit requirements are being met. Those are your deviation reports or your annual permit evaluation report. STAC test results, which are essentially a mechanism for sharing compliance information with Ohio EPA. Equipment malfunctions or emission releases, those would be what you would call your immediate notifications. and then unscheduled and scheduled maintenance. In addition to these types of reporting, fee reports also take up a big chunk of the reporting that's involved once you receive an air permit. These are fees that are based on actual emissions and will be sent to Ohio EPA at different frequencies depending on what type of facility you are. So reporting frequencies will be spelled out in the permit, either in the standard terms or emission unit specific terms. Frequency is typically established by the rules or Ohio EPA Terms and Conditions Library. They can be annual, semi-annual, quarterly, or after one of those events like a malfunction. Check the front of your issued permits for your standard terms and EU specific terms. So again, the most common types of permits you are likely to experience, and you can have all of these at your facility. The types of reports we're looking at here now, one facility could be subject to all these reporting requirements at some point. It's not a one size fits all for sure. So let's take a poll. Have you submitted any of the following types of reports to Ohio EPA? And I know I said that facilities could have multiples of these, so pick your favorite if you've submitted more or one of these.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll now. Just a heads up, this is our final poll, so this is your last chance to participate interactively, so please do so. You're about halfway there. Give it a couple more moments. Okay, last chance. Going. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close it out and share those results. Back to you, Stephanie.
All right. Very interesting poll. I'm glad we asked this question. So it's good to see that some folks do have some experience. 45% of you do not. So I think you're going to learn something in this next part of the presentation. We're going to really dive into the different reporting types. So feel free to chat in any questions, anything that comes to mind. We are going to hit the reporting side pretty hard this round. So the newest type of report, and when I say new, this is new as of 2008, is the Permit Evaluation Report. So it was created as part of the new permitting strategy that Ohio underwent when they created the PTIO permitting process. Historically, all facilities, Title V to non-Title V facilities, had quarterly reporting requirements. So the PER was established to simplify reporting for small companies. It's an annual report that has a lot of pre-populated fields in it. So a lot of the information is going to pull from information you put in your air permit application, which is why having that info correct and accurate is important. It will cover all of the emission units that have been issued a PTIO at your facility. And again, most importantly, it replaces those quarterly reports. Just as a caveat, it does not replace those rule-based reporting or synthetic minor reporting related to avoid federal requirements like Title V or MACT. And when I say rule-based reporting, that would be one of those rule notifications, whether you're subject to OAC 3745-2109. In the event that maybe you use a non-compliant coding, the rule requires a 30-day notification after that incident has occurred. That is not covered in the PER. That would be a separate report. So Ohio EPA will mail out your reminder for non-Title V facilities that a PER is due, and they will include the form that, again, will have that pre-populated information along with the emission units that have been issued a PTIO. The PER is actually an opportunity for you to make corrections to what is on file, and we'll see some of those fields in the upcoming slides. The due date for the PERs is on the 15th of every quarter. So February 15th, May 15th, August 15th, or November 15th. And also, truth be told, you can choose your own PER due date. And personally, I have not gone down that road. So if that's a path that you decide to take, I highly recommend reaching out to your permit writer, because that's something you'll have to do ahead of time before the permit is issued. So here we have what looks like the annual permit evaluation report, or the PER, or the PER, depending on what part of the state you're in. The parts where you see the brackets, that information there is what's going to be pre-populated. So the facility name and ID, the primary contact, which could change. And if it does have to change, you'll see that the box below gives you the opportunity to make any corrections there. If you make corrections in this PER, you should see them show up in the next annual report. So this is table 1. That's going to list out all the emission units that have a PTIO at your facility. It's going to have some basic information about them, specifically the permit number and the effective date. Additionally, there will be a spot where you can make any corrections to that information, or anything that, if you want to update the emission description, this is a good place to do it. And then the report also has responsibility language that promises that it'll be submitted on time and that everything is accurate. You'll notice in this portion where this language shows up, you don't see a signature line. That's because this permit doesn't require a signature. And then page 3 is where the compliance part comes into play. Here you'll see detailed emissions unit information. You'll have your installation dates, which may or may not have the fields filled out, depending on where you are in the construction process and the permitting process. There might be some overlap there. If you do receive this PER and those fields are left blank, I encourage you to fill them in, and we can update our system. So then the next time you see this form, you'll see those already pre-populated. And then you'll also notice below that section of the form is where we start to get into the attestation about compliance. You'll see asking for any exceedances in the following areas. And that goes back to that criteria we talked about with the emission unit specific terms in the permit, those operational restrictions, emission limitations, monitoring, record keeping, and reporting. And then you'll see, depending on how you answer those questions, it's going to take you through additional steps. So for example, if you answer yes or no, you might not have to include any information. If you say no, then you're done. If you say yes, additional information is needed. Typical information we see when somebody reports deviations would be the dates it occurred, the duration, the probable cause, corrective action. Sometimes people, depending on how their record keeping is set up, will just attach a record for that day. And I don't want to scare you with this by saying, oh, well, we have deviations, we have to do this. Deviations are common. It happens. No process runs 100%. It's better to let us know about it in case it does become an ongoing issue, and that way we can, discuss next steps forward and remedying the situation. Our goal is always compliance, and the more information we have, the better we can help. So quarterly reports are only going to apply to all synthetic minor and Title V facilities going forward. These quarterly deviation reports will usually require statements about visible emission observations, reporting on emission limits or production or operational limitations, deviations from the control device parameters. So the other caveat with the quarterly deviation reports is, well, if I didn't have any deviations, do I just not submit anything? And the answer is you have to submit something. So what Ohio EPA has done is try to spell out that negative declaration reports are needed. In other words, facilities must submit a report every quarter, regardless of whether or not deviations occurred. This can be found in the standard terms and conditions, as well as the emission unit specific terms and conditions. And these can be general statements just saying no deviations occurred. And if you decide to get into air services, which if you're submitting quarterly reports, you'll be in air services anyways, we've seen stuff that are just statements such as no deviations occurred during the quarter, and that's sufficient, so long as there's no other information that says otherwise. So the next type of reports is outside of those reports that have those established frequencies, such as the PER and the quarterly reports. Malfunctions are reports that require an immediate notification from the facility. I highly suggest using the better safe than sorry reporting approach for these types of situations. A malfunction is what we consider a breakdown of a source or control equipment that results in a violation. Scheduled or unscheduled maintenance should be performed to avoid a malfunction. And when we say scheduled, we mean 2 weeks prior to notice, which means the maintenance should have occurred 2 weeks before the incident occurred. Additionally, we will ask for information regarding how the shutdown of air pollution control equipment would impact the process. And depending on the duration, additional actions may be required. This is an example of a malfunction. And if you see something like this at your facility, I hope you would know what to do. Whether it's the operators are going and contacting your environmental person or plant manager. When situations like this start to arise, that's when decisions need to be made about shutting down the process. Well, where are we at in the process? If shutting down the process is going to contribute to damaging the process or the air pollution control equipment, you're probably going to be in a different reporting category for the malfunctions. So this slide summarizes the rule where the malfunctions can be found. It's OAC 3745 1506B. And I want to just add a note that on June 8th, 2022, Ohio EPA issued draft updates to the malfunction rule for public comment. I don't know if any of you have seen them, but I know that they're going around. So essentially what the draft is calling for are revised definitions emphasizing that an event where there is an exceedance of an applicable standard constitutes a malfunction. Ohio EPA is also proposing revisions to the reporting procedure as well. And this is a big one. So historically, you could just send an email after hours, and that was sufficient for reporting a malfunction. Well, the rule is going to spell out that the proposed rule is going to spell out that between the hours of 8 a.m. and 5 p.m., you are required, you can call or send an email during normal business hours. But outside of those hours, you're required to use the spill hotline to report 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Additionally, and I left this on here with the 2 weeks because it's still what's in the rule, but what's proposed is that if you have a malfunction that lasts longer than 72 hours, the reporting window is going to shrink from 2 weeks to 1 week. So again, I think using the spill line outside of normal business hours is a good habit to get into. But regarding the reporting requirement, if you're longer than 72 hours, just be cognizant of that might change and become more stringent. So the criteria listed here is all spelled out in the rule. And with the changes that Ohio EPA is proposing to make and based on comments from the public and the regulated entities, much of this will probably maintain the same. Essentially, what we're doing is we're looking for information to conduct an investigation as to what happened and how long, and to verify the information provided. So last but not least, we have a couple of other reports to squeeze in here as we're talking about the structure of an air permit. And those include the federal rules, which are the MACT, GACT, or NSPS rules. You only have to worry about these rules if they apply to your source. And again, this could be a different type of notification. For example, if you're subject to NSPS 000, you might have ongoing testing requirements, or you might have a semi-annual report. Or if you're an area source and maybe you operate a spray booth at an automotive refinishing facility, it might just be an initial notification where you fill out a form with name, info, and send it in, and you're good to go. Additionally, we have our state rules, which we touched on a little bit. One being that reporting frequency of 30 days or 45 days within a violation, not necessarily violation, a deviation, and that would be if you used a non-compliant coating. So potentially a coating that had maybe a higher VOC content than what was required by OAC 3745-2109. So compliance reports in general, and just some other questions to ask yourself when you're compiling the data to submit your report. Think about if you've received an NOV. Have you reviewed your quarterly reports before submitting your annual reports? Your goal is to review all of the records and make sure all of that information is accurate and demonstrates compliance. If it doesn't, know what you need to do to report it accordingly. And that could be providing records, reaching out to your air permit contact ahead of time. Additionally, in keeping up with all of those permitting requirements, continue to review them. Even if you're going through the renewal process, sometimes terms change. The PTIO process has a 10-year expiration date, and things can change in 10 years. So make sure you're reading your permit. Make sure the documents that you're submitting, you're looking at them multiple times a year and that they're updated and accurate, that they have the right contact information, that they're reporting for the right period of time. All those things can make your reporting situation a lot better and a lot more accurate. So in addition to the self-reporting that facilities do, facilities are also subject to fee emission reports. And this is all classifications of facilities in the permitting program. This includes non-Title V facilities that are every 2 years. Synthetic minor facilities have their annual permitting requirements, and Title V has the annual permitting requirements as well. These types of fees are going to be based on your actual emissions, and they're typically mailed out in February and due April 15th. Once the report is returned to Ohio EPA, it'll be reviewed and an invoice will be sent out. So this year was actually a blue card year. This is the non-Title V fee reports. This is where emissions are totaled for the entire facility and are going to include your particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxides, organic compounds, and lead. And the units of measurement here are going to be in tons. So you can see the annual fees are based on a range. And depending on what that range is, you'll get an invoice. So since this year was a reporting cycle for the blue cards, we can say that the reporting cycle happens on even years. So the last cycle was for 2020 and 2021. This next reporting cycle, which will happen in 2024, will be for 2022 and 2023. So typically, the more emissions you have, the more expensive the fee. And calculations aren't necessary for this type of fee emission report, but can be requested depending on the circumstances. Additionally, if you change ownership during this period, and it's still within that 2-year cycle, it's possible that 2 entities could be billed separately for the same facility. And we also have additional guidance. This slide lists the website that goes into non-title fees, and you'll also be able to navigate to the whole fee structure for how we assess fees. So Title V and synthetic minor fees are similar in that they're both annual reports. These types of fee reports will require calculations with submittal. The report itself will contain all the emission units that are applicable, and each emission unit will have a fee associated with it. These reports are required to be submitted via e-business air services. And Title V facilities pay by the ton versus synthetic minor facilities that pay by a range, which is similar to that non-Title V fee schedule we saw on the previous slide. And again, the link on this website actually is the fee schedule that's going to show you all of these different fee structures. So if you're curious about other types of fees and what they look like, I highly recommend checking out this link. So that is the last of the reporting. Like I said, I was not kidding when it is the bulk of the second half of this presentation. But we're going to move on to the testing requirements, which is the second to last part of your air permit. And what I think is one of the more interesting parts of the permit as well, because it has a lot of the underlying criteria for how those emission limits were established and even some of that rule applicability, how you get there. So the testing requirements are going to include your methodology for determining compliance with limits and operational restrictions. The typical examples we see are stack testing, which if you're required to do a stack test, your facility will have specific language in there that will establish a schedule for when that emission unit needs to be scheduled. It'll spell out criteria for how the emission unit should be tested, what methods to use, and when it should be completed. Additionally, you might see some US EPA methods in there if you decide you want to test on your own. I would say one of the most common ones we see is for VOC content. And then what you also see, which don't necessarily require you to take any immediate action or do anything additional, are calculations. I do suggest looking at your calculations every so often, especially if you use an emission factor. Racheal had some really good tips about WebFire and AP42 where you can find emission factors. Believe it or not, sometimes they get updated and they change. So check in with those and see and make sure you're using the best data when calculating emissions. And then last but not least is the miscellaneous requirements. Most likely, most of you probably will not have anything in this section. This is where information that seems relevant but doesn't really fit in with the rest of the terms go. The first example is the portable language, which I think is the most common type of language you'll see here. And when I say portable language, I think most of you will know who you are who have portable equipment. It's just equipment that moves around the state. Other examples include if changes are made to federal rules and the permit doesn't need to be modified. Sometimes this could be a compliance demonstration. The federal rules will give you some flexibility with how you demonstrate compliance with the rule. And depending on how you demonstrate compliance with the rule, doesn't necessarily mean you have to file for a modification of the permit. You can do it. You might just have to report it. And the miscellaneous requirements is a good place to put that. And then in terms of other examples, I don't have other examples, but I'm sure they're out there. So some additional tips and resources. We have a lot out there. The customer support center is a great place. I still call it the answer place. You can still use your answer place IDs there for finding support for what your interests are, what you need to know. I will say that for the air side of things, a lot of the topics that you see there are based on real world experiences. They're prepared by our central office. So they're usually based on questions that they get from the regulated entities on how to navigate the system. So that's always a really good place to start, is with that customer support center or our website. Here's a look at the interface. I think it has changed a little bit since it was Air Services. This is the customer service center. You can see that the answer place ID will still work depending on how you search for things. Here are some great answer place IDs to keep in your back pocket if you ever feel like you're in a brain fog. There's some really good trainings out there. There's actual training videos that can walk you through the process if you're a little more of a visual person. And then you also have your FAQ stuff available depending on what you need. So this slide has some additional web links available to you. I do want to highlight the Air Services info website. If you haven't used our Air Services or are curious about it, I highly, highly, highly recommend that you explore it. There's a lot of perks in terms of file management and managing your data. For example, once you submit that application, that data is saved in Air Services. So if you need to go back and submit a renewal or submit a modification, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. A lot of that information is already going to be in the system, and it's going to make your life a lot easier. I will say some pitfalls that people tend to meet is when you have changeover from the previous position. So maybe the person before you was the Air Services person and you need to gain access. It sounds really daunting, but central office is always available to help walk you through the process and to get you into Air Services. It's what they do, so don't hesitate to reach out. And also on that note, I can't encourage you enough to reach out to your local representatives, whether you're at a district office or a local air agency. Those folks that you work with are going to be the best and the brightest for getting you information on compliance at your facility, because most of the time, those are the people that have written your permit, they review your reports, and even do your inspections. So they're experts. Use them. So just some key takeaways from this session and just working with the APC as a whole. Our goal is compliance, not enforcement. Develop record-keeping forms that mirror the terms in your permit. And if you're not sure what that's supposed to look like, reach out to us. We're here to help. Work towards understanding what type of permits are required and record due dates. Set alerts in your calendar so you can submit those reports ahead of time, or sign up for Air Services and you can submit them instantaneously. Know your operations. Know your operations and stay in touch with your staff. Training should be ongoing. Things change, permits change. Keep your folks in the know. And don't be afraid of the Customer Support Center or your Ohio EPA representative.
All right. Thank you so much to Stephanie and Racheal. That was really excellent information. And now we are going to move over to our question and answer portion of today. So we have some questions that have been submitted throughout the presentation, and I'm going to go ahead and read those. There's still probably some time if you have a question you want to get in, and we'll try to see if we have time to answer it. If we do not get to your question today through this portion, we will reach out to you via email following today's session. Okay, so I'm going to open this back up to both Racheal and Stephanie, and I do have a question for you guys, and whoever wants to answer it is fine with me. And the question is, if you modify an existing permit with a new minor source, why does the permit still expire at the original date? For example, 10 years, why is it not 10 years from the modification date?
I'll grab this one. This is Racheal.
Thanks,
so the
Racheal.
permit expiration date for emission units at the facility remains the same unless all of the units are modified such that they would get a new expiration date. So when a permit is issued for just one unit, it gives the same expiration date as the others. And the intent of this is that facilities with lots of emission units don't have to juggle multiple expiration and renewal dates. You have one date to remember to submit that renewal application.
Excellent. Thank you for that. All right. Stephanie, why don't I throw this one to you then? If a facility is requesting a synthetic minor limit to avoid Title V, what construction activities are allowable before obtaining a permit?
So I will generally say that the pre-construction activities for a synthetic minor facility are limited. I would encourage you to take a look at the rule because it does break it up from the non-Title V facilities versus a synthetic minor or a Title V. They're very similar, and there's not a lot you can do. I know Racheal had her slide that talks about like the utility type work, land clearing, and things like that. Those things are able to occur. But in terms of bringing any equipment on site, that would not be allowed prior to obtaining it. What I would encourage you to do is before or even during putting together your application, or depending on where you are in your process, to take a look at OAC 3745, 3133, and that'll give you the whole comprehensive list of what you can and can't do.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, next question. Are the de minimis source exemptions determined based on actual emissions or requested emissions? You want to snag that one, Racheal?
I sure do. So the de minimis exemption is based on the source's potential to emit over a 24-hour period. So if you look at that de minimis rule, which is 3745, 1505, there's definitions associated with that, and it will spell out exactly what potential to emit is. But it is, going to be that worst case, those worst case emissions over a 24-hour period, and it's not based on the source's actual emissions.
Very good. Okay, this was a more specific question, but I'm just going to ask it more generally. And Stephanie, if you want to answer it. It was from someone who submitted an application and hadn't heard from us. So I'm just going to ask, at what point should you try to reach out and see where you are with the agency and your permit? How long should they wait to hear something from us, or should they reach out and contact us?
So I would suggest, in terms of deciding whether to wait or when to reach out, go with your gut. If you want an update, permit writers are happy to give you an update. You can just send an email and they should be able to tell you right where it is in the process. I encourage facilities to reach out often. All questions are good questions. And I would say if you haven't heard back or you haven't gotten your renewal permit yet, go ahead and reach out. I think it's good, and it brings you back into the loop with what's going on. And if there's something else where you need that permit a little bit more expeditiously, you can always bring that to the permit writer's attention as well. So, and if you don't have your permit writer's contact information, you can look it up by county through our website on one of the links provided. And based on that county, you can get in touch with your permit writer just right from that website. Also, and this is kind of just a weird off chance that maybe something got issued, but you haven't seen it, you can always check our issued permits document, website. But I know you don't have a permit number, but you can, if you know your facility ID, you can search by your facility ID, because there is, maybe a small chance that it's already been issued. So it's not on anyone's radar anymore, and it's just getting it to you. I would try those two venues, but definitely reach out if you ever have any questions. Don't hesitate, for sure.
Great, thank you. I'd say in summary, just from Racheal and Stephanie, when in doubt, reach out. We are really happy to help for anything. Okay. This one is about de minimis. So Racheal, I can kick this one to you again if you want. It says, if a company discovers that the potential to emit calculations for a unit were in fact not the worst case possible, the units don't have a permit, but during monitoring, the emissions were under the de minimis thresholds, what sort of follow-up should a company do?
Great. So if you find that you thought you were de minimis, but actually you're not, you may consider reaching out to us. When in doubt, reach out certainly applies here. The de minimis rule allows a de minimis via record keeping option. You might look into that and see if, maybe your site was complying with that record keeping option already, or you have data that shows that you may have really been in compliance with that de minimis. However, if you find that that's not the case, that you're not de minimis via record keeping, that source would certainly need a permit, and so you would want to proceed down the route of applying for a permit. Because the source is already installed, those fees would be doubled to address that issue.
Okay, and I think I probably botched this question a little bit, because it does sound like when they did the monitoring, they were actually below the de minimis thresholds. Is there anything they would need to do then?
So the de minimis rule is pretty specific to what that monitoring has to include. And so you have to include, that monitoring is on a daily basis to show that your daily emissions are less than those 10 pounds per day. So I would urge them to look at that rule to make sure that they've met that requirement. And if not, reach out and ask, can you proceed being de minimis via record keeping, or are you required to get a permit at that point? So talk to your permit person so they can look at that with you and make sure that you're on the right path for compliance.
Fantastic. Okay, next question. Can you operate under a permit application?
I will take this one. I think it depends what we're talking about when we're talking about operating under a permit application. If it's the first time that you're applying for something and it's a brand new process, no, you can't just operate under a permit application. In terms of maybe some contractual work or getting the equipment, whatever contracts you enter into, that's all at the risk to the owner and operator. It's always good to get your permit first before going down that road. If you're talking about submitting a renewal type application and your permit expires, you are covered under your previous permit until the new renewal is issued. So that could kind of be an instance of where you're operating just based on an air application. And then with Title V, it's kind of a similar situation, what they call the permit shield, where you're required, and this is why you want to get your application in before the expiration date, is if you are able to do that, then there's no disruption in the way you operate or with your permit being viable and things of that nature. So I hope I answered that question, or gave you some more food for thought, maybe.
Okay, I'd say yeah. I think that's fine. Okay. So next question. This is for someone who is currently operating a C&D facility that is now required to get a PTIO. Is that something that they can complete the application without hiring an outside firm?
I'll grab this one. So the application forms are found on our website. You can certainly fill out those application forms without getting any outside help. They're pretty straightforward. What the struggle might be is performing those potential to emit calculations for landfills. So landfills use a program called LandGEM to estimate potential to emit for the future as that waste breaks down. So if that isn't something that you're familiar with, that can be kind of complicated, but LandGEM is found on US EPA's website.
Fantastic. Okay. This is a follow-up to a malfunction question, so I'll give it to you, Stephanie. If a malfunction occurs outside of business hours, do we call the Ohio EPA spill hotline in addition to notifying our local air agency contact?
Good question. So logistically, I am not sure what that is going to look like, and if the locals have access to the spill hotline. I believe, and I will double check on this, but I'm not 100% sure, that those messages on the spill line will be forwarded to the appropriate local air agency, and they will get that information. So I'm 90% sure that is the case, but I will double check for you and get back with you if they will be forwarding those to the locals. Because I know at one point, and this was many, many years ago, the locals had their own spill lines available. So it might also be worth reaching out specifically to your contact at the local agency to verify what their plan of action would be.
Okay, and I just want to stress, because you went through with the slides, that the spill hotline part of it is a proposed rule right now that is not final at all and has not been put into code. So people don't get too confused. That was something that is drafted and considered, but it has not been finalized.
Yes, thank you for clarifying.
Just making sure.
So keep doing what you're doing until you hear otherwise.
Okay. All right, questions are coming in a lot now. All right, next question. If our site is going to submit a PTI for equipment, are we able to purchase the equipment that will be installed after the PTI is approved? Does purchasing equipment fall into construction activities? And for example, this is all would be at a major criteria pollutant source. Racheal, you want to go for that one? I can read it again if you want.
So if it's at a minor source, like the PTIO type of source, you could, under the site preparation activities, do that. However, if it is at a major source, I believe that would fall under entering into a contract for installation. So you would not want to be doing that.
This is another one I would look through the rules and reach out to your contact also, because it probably depends on what type and how long the lead time is for that. I think there may be some options you have. All right. Next question. We'll kick this one to Stephanie. If a process will be in temporary shutdown for, say, a year, can the agency issue a temporary suspension of the permit?
So we wouldn't issue a suspension of the permit. What we can do is there are different operating scenarios for emission units. So say, for example, inactive is one of them. And that might be something that we would assign to that specific emission unit during that time period. But in terms of any permitting actions, we wouldn't open the permit for that. And also, depending on what the shutdown is for and what the scope of that is, I would just make sure that you evaluate that you're not creating a new emission unit or something like that that might need additional permitting terms and conditions, or the terms and conditions might not be valid anymore. So I would just keep that scope in mind too while doing a temporary shutdown. I'm just imagining that you might, once you bring it online, have to go through maybe like some engineering studies or testing to make sure everything's running right. But in terms of a temporary suspension, that's not something that we do. We could revoke the permit, but that would require you to apply for a new permit, and I don't think that's what you're after.
Okay, next question. This will be for Racheal. If a tenant is operating at a rented facility, can you address liability, responsibility, et cetera, for property owner versus tenant? Who is the operator?
So I'm curious if you are just renting the property or if you are renting the equipment. The owner and operator are potentially liable under Ohio EPA's rules. So whether you are the owner of the equipment being operated or the operator.
Thank you. All right. Next one. If we have a contractor painting the exterior of a building, do we need to obtain a permit for that painting operation? Stephanie, did you want to take that one, or answer that one?
I was going to try and see if I could look in the rule, but off the top of my head, I don't have a good answer for this one.
Okay, I think I can answer this one. There is a section for like sort of temporary activities and things like that. Just the quick answer is no. You would not. Anything that's that short. In temporary, it's not. There is a section that has some exemptions that this would be part of, but yeah, no, we do not require any air permits for temporary painting activities like that. So that is the last question that I have. Give it like another. Yep, it looks to be my organizer's telling me that is it. So we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Racheal and Stephanie, for your great presentation, and thanks to everyone for attending this 2022 Virtual Compliance Assistance session. Before we end the session today, we'd like to point your attention to another one of today's environmental fun facts. On this slide, we are highlighting Clay High School's Encouraging Environmental Excellence in Education, which is the E4 award. Clay High School in Oregon, Ohio was recently recognized with a branch-level award for having an active environmental club, student involvement with recycling, reducing energy, and generating renewable wind energy on site. The E4 program recognizes any K-12 public or private school for their achievements in environmental stewardship and their efforts to educate students on environmental topics. You can scan the QR code on this slide to get more information about the E4 program and to apply. Ohio EPA hosts a series of webinars throughout the year on a variety of environmental topics. This slide provides information on how to register for these upcoming webinars, where to find recordings of previous webinars, and how to sign up to receive notifications of upcoming webinars through our Ohio EPA Customer Support Center. And with that, we will end this session of Ohio EPA's 2022 Virtual Compliance Assistance Conference. We hope you can join us for other conference sessions. We are just getting started. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope you all have a great day.